Well, welcome, Dana, to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. For those of you that don't know Dana, she is an incredible embodied woman, and I love the work that she's doing. And we actually met because we were living together when I lived in Santa Cruz, California. And I've felt so much growth by just being in your energy and hearing your own personal story around grief and love. So I wanted to invite that conversation. And I want to start off with maybe sharing a little bit about what it is that you do in the world, what it is that you are sharing with the work, and then dive into a little bit about grief and love and your journey with that.
Hi.
Hi.
So good to have you.
Thank you, Samantha. Janessa. So sweet to connect this way and the weaving happening and just in celebration of you bringing your voices into the world and inviting other voices to join you. And so honored and excited to be here. And just see what comes through, what wants to be spoken.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a licensed LMFT and have a private practice here in Santa Cruz. And I see individuals and couples, and I also facilitate community grief rituals and community rituals associated with the moon and divine feminine, and so it's the work kind of just continues to show itself based on my life experience and what's kind of being asked of me. I have a lot of fire in my nature, and so I'll start things I don't even quite know what I'm starting or what they entail, and it just kind of shows the way. And so my whole kind of life's work and what brings me joy, my service has emerged from my life experience, and often from a lot of pain, and a lot of going into the darkness, going deep inside and into the place of soul that I really believe we have to descend into. It's not like an ascension process to soul. It's like a stripping away, like dying process to contact our soul, and the rebirth that starts to merge with what's really true, what doesn't die, and what gets purified in those sacred fires and waters of all of it. And,
yes.
So that's kind of my entry point was like many of us was kind of a choiceless choice to face and follow and alchemize and dance with what I didn't want to dance and face. At least many parts of me didn't. So I feel inspired to maybe just share a little bit about some of my earlier process of descending.
Yes.
And that will give a context too of what you're inviting around the sacred marriage and the union of grief and love and grief and praise and death and life, and and I'm hoping that as I share, like those that are listening on can really feel the universality of this story of descent and rebirth and union, and that it's my story, but it really feels like it's a story that the soul goes through in all the different beautiful unique ways. And so one way that I've been told by storytellers and kind of mythologist is, perhaps listen with ears that have you wonder just where maybe my story touches your heart, or where you maybe even doesn't touch your heart and you're like in complete aversion towards it. That's also a place of could be curiosity. And yeah, and I hope that this time together is, feeds the heart, feeds the soul, feeds what matters, and can be of nourishment to life and all of our togetherness. Just that remembrance that we're all in this crazy, wild place of life together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dana. So beautifully well put.
Yeah, before we dive in, can we just take one collective breath with us all and our listeners?
I would love that.
So ready to dive deep with you, Dana. Thank you.
We've been inspired to continue to hear about the path of the spiral journey, and it's often associated with a more feminine descent process. And again, this isn't about gender, this is more about energetics, and that we all hold feminine and masculine energies in us, and each of them are necessary for our wholeness. And the story of the feminine, the reverence, the space of wisdom of the feminine has, as we all very well know, very much been pushed underground and, been really rejected for quite some time. And I know that harms every being and every life form. And this spiral path is really, what I kind of started this off with is it's a return, but it has the descent into what was forgotten and into the places that are scary and that we naturally don't want to go. And it's really into the darkness, so there's, I think I just want to open up that as a remembrance for us all of the spiral path, um, and just the courage of our souls to inhabit as a human, knowing that this is what I believe we've signed up to do. And there's choice, and I also refer it to as like a choiceless choice, because when we resist it, like shit gets harder.
Yeah.
And so,
And louder.
And louder, yeah. And our bodies start to talk, and our lives get more and more, unstable, and there's also brilliance in that. Sometimes we need exactly those things as the bigger like chasm that we have to go through. And we can still grip. And I respect, all the parts in us that will still grip, and know those in myself. It's such a big surrender process to say yes to the choiceless choice. And yeah, so my biggest kind of choiceless choice was at 16. My nickname was like Sunshine, because you can see me like a blonde hair. There's lots of sunshine passing through this space where I practice, and
a rainbow right through your face.
Beautiful. And I had a lot of good, like real good enough parenting, and a lot of privilege, and a lot of beauty, and also challenge, particularly with my father. And but at 16, something really cracked for me. I still don't fully understand what happened, but my kind of social, easygoing self really shifted, and I could barely kind of exist in the world. My nervous system was incredibly overwhelmed and kind of beyond overwhelmed, where like I couldn't even name that I was scared. It was like in that place of the nervous system. It's called the vagus nerve, and it's a dorsal vagal. So we're in fight flight, which a lot of us know, and unfortunately we live there and dwell there. And then there's this even deeper, it's like a beyond life threat energy called within the dorsal vagal. And many of us know that as well. It's where we're, pretty shut down. Our brain state really changes. Our eyesight often will change. It's just this real foggy, like overwhelmed state, coupled often with utter terror
Mm.
and beyond words. We're not verbal in that state really. So that's what happened. And I have some ideas of what led me there. It felt like it was in a lot of ways like a shamanic initiation. But there wasn't a community or like the sisterhood or the wise womanhood or to actually recognize what was happening and to hold me through it. So fortunately, in the best way we can in our modern American culture with a hodgepodge of cultures and being a white woman from European background, I'm largely an orphan in a lot of ways spiritually because the ancestry of European wisdom traditions really got cut off in history and with the onset of Christian colonialism and all of that, right? So with this modern space, there were psychotherapists that I started to seek out, like, because I had just had no idea what was happening. I had no words to even know what switched so dramatically. And yeah, and it just felt like I was like kind of in like a glass wall, where I was trying to act as if I was who I was, but it was such an act and it took so much energy. And I can still feel kind of a tearfulness, behind my eyes of how intense that was, and how scary. And, and during that time, I sought out, psychotherapy to support, and it's such a gift, to receive that kind of holding. And it was still took me a long, long time to start to understand and pull the pieces together of what was actually happening. So this was over a decade, 2 decades ago. So I'm 36 when I was 16. And even then the psychotherapy world, was really brought in with a lot of clinical perspective, a lot of kind of cognitive behavioral, like thought patterns and neurochemistry of what's off in the brain and da 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 da. And my soul really rebelled against those types of labels and frameworks and was diagnosed with clinical depression and, anxiety and but something just was like, that doesn't really feel true, and at that time the model was kind of like, well, if you're suffering like this for a certain amount of time, and for me it would cycle, like I would go into these black holes, this kind of underworld experience that started to really ring true to me, this more mythic understanding of where I would go, which would of course correlate to all the other layers of reality, which include neurochemistry and physiology and behavior. All of that was part of it, but there, this mythic place was really, really spoke to my soul and allowed me to bear it as well, like bear the unbearable. And so I just really rejected this kind of framework that still is very strong today, that there's a neurochemical imbalance, that is the cause, that is the cure, that is a life sentence basically, of suffering and limitation. And I just didn't feel that was true, but it was also so desperate, which I hold so much compassion to the overwhelm and the longing to have, and someone who may know what the fuck is going on, to start to tend to the unbearable gaping wound that so I really hold a lot of compassion with those that seek that kind of support and have found refuge with those kind of frameworks. And I think they are a piece to the picture, and I just don't feel the whole piece. And so it was many years of just really swimming in the darkness, going down and getting tousled, and just so much of my identity of what I thought how I could be perceived by others, or how I wanted to be perceived by others, was just being stripped again and again and again, because I just couldn't control how my body felt. I couldn't control if I could look someone in the eye or not, or if I could engage them with a warm smile, which my heart wanted to do, but my body was in utter terror. So there was just a lot of just surrendering of what was possible. And so this went on for some time, for over 7 years, going to undergrad, and just kind of barely getting by, and I'd reemerge and kind of feel myself, and then certain triggers would take me down again. And in that time, there was a lot of wounding around sexual assault and abuse of alcohol correlated with that just set up a certain certain soul material, you might say, that was for me to tend to. And I know so many of us share.
Dana, what I'm hearing is that, and I've heard this in Francis Weller's work around rites of passage and this liminal space, this in-between space, the dark void, as you had said, where there's so many unanswered, there's so many things that are unanswered. And for us, especially in the Western world, as you said, without support, mentorship, community, education, all of these things, people can get stuck there. And we're seeing that with the homeless population on the rise as well. And so I'm grateful that you had that support at that time, even if it wasn't the entire picture, as you mentioned, because a lot of that is very cognizant, and a lot of it is, it sounded like it can be a band-aid rather than getting to the root, to the soul. So you are such a
that lens. It's such a beautiful, powerful lens to bring into those liminal spaces, and to really see the collective, journey that we're being asked to go through. And I'm glad that you're presencing the homeless population and those that are struggling most intensely with trauma. I just, it's really tragic. Really, really tragic to see so many beings who probably in many other societies and times would have been brought in to be those that have direct communion with what matters in the spirit world. Right. And they're lost, and we're lost because they're lost, and we're, so I appreciate you presencing that. And Francis Weller is a really dear man to me. I've gotten to experience him in a lot of different contexts, and
his work is incredible.
Yeah, and I'll speak to a little bit later, but he's one of the dear people who held space for me in my grief process, and learned from how to hold community grief ritual, and so the liminal space, right? And I want to presence too, just the allyship of the animal of the butterfly, and the butterfly is often considered the soul animal, and we're often just so drawn to them as humans, just the miracle of their transformation and their absolute disintegration of what they once were in the cocoon process, and just the poetry of that they're dissolving in imaginal cells, and in that darkness, that mushiness, they're literally wrapped in this gold. I don't know if you've ever seen, particularly the monarch that I feel deeply connected with. When they're in the green part of the cocoon, there's this like filament of gold that's wrapping around them. Have you seen that?
I actually just saw it recently, like New Year's Day. I was at a party and there were those monarchs like just around this like flower pot, and it was just, I've never seen that before. It was magical.
Really it's so wild, and so it's Psyche, which is a mythic, reference to a goddess. Psyche is often correlated to the word soul as well. So psychology, the study of the soul, right? And so you can feel like, even as I was sharing earlier, like what the layers of healing that I think are important and that we expand into, of neurochemistry and all of those important layers, they've also lost the touch often with the essence of where it originated from, of the study of soul. And if that's not there, it just doesn't work, in my opinion. So yeah, I just want to presence that butterfly in the liminal space, and the strength that it takes for us to be in this transformative, metamorphosis of soul that we're in. And also as a collective, this time of COVID has been, to me, like very clearly a cocooning, transformative, metamorphizing process. And it's fucking rough too. It's really fucking rough. Also to not have that kind of mythic perspective that can support us there.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives just our lives, your life, Janessa, me, and I'm sure anyone who's listening can also relate to this, but it gives me so much hope because people who have really danced in the darkness with the dark night of their soul, and it is possible to make it out stronger, and just allowing all of that to, as he says, cook us, Francis Weller, to cook us, to become, in that chrysalis process, these beautiful beings that we were born to become and to embody.
And so much hope. And also, here it comes with the grief, right? So much grief of those also that don't make it through in this way. And I think it's really important that that's not seen as a failure as either. It kind of reminds me of like the overemphasis on like fighting the thing, like fighting the cancer, fighting the thing, and I think it's beautiful to have that fight in the way that serves. And I also think, I don't even quite know how to hold it entirely, but I just, as you were speaking, like, there's an importance to make room for those that don't make it in the way that we think make it looks like, and just hold the mystery that those journeys are making it somehow, and that there's also a lot of grief in how they don't come through in the way that we would hope, So yeah, so I'm just going to continue on a little bit of a journey of the path, and I'm hoping again that this just serves, resonance and for others. And it's such a gift to tell my story, and I get to learn more from it every time I share it, and I never quite know what's going to come out of these lips. So that's kind of exciting and scary too. Yeah, so there's just a lot of suffering, a lot of confusion, a lot of, all the stories that emerge around identifying with the pain as well, of who that makes me be, mentally ill, makes me unlovable, makes me projections of the future of, will I ever be okay? Just so much belonging. Can I belong? Am I, this othering principle that starts to happen too in our languaging of mentally ill and those that are not, the professional and the one that needs to be healed. Like all these divisions also just felt really off, right? And I had some pretty fiery blessings, where some of that healthy fire was coming through. I'll just name one because it feels important. I remember it was about 22, actually younger, maybe 20, in the undergrad, and suffering tremendously and trying different medications, and I was pretty resistant to the medication, as many people are, not wanting to be dependent on something to just live, and the identities that go with that, and blah, blah, blah. And it didn't really fucking work either. So that was also there. And which I'm glad it works for some people. It's amazing. And I was sitting in front of a psychiatrist, a male psychiatrist, and he was kind of challenging me, like, why don't you want to take your medication? And I kind of said, like, well, it's hard. Kind of just what I just told you, like, makes me feel like something's wrong with me. He's like, well, just looked me straight in the eyes and he said, well, something is wrong with you. And I just felt this like, like energy come up, you know.
Kali.
He was snatching, yeah, he was snatching like definitely a part of me that was holding that narrative and that fear. But there was something in being that externalized and being said from this person at that time that had me like come into clarity, and it was just like, wow, something is really fucking wrong about this picture, actually. You know, like that you're the healer and the doctor, and that's your remedy in this moment relationally. This isn't right. Yeah, you're right. Something is really fucking wrong. You know, that clarity really came through, you know, and I thank that man for that. You know, I really do. It was just like, wow.
Pivotal moment.
No, that is not me, you know, and even though a voice may say that, like, there's something called humility, you know, and for you to sit behind this chair, kind of pointing this finger of something is wrong with me, just feels so fucking wrong, so disconnecting, you know, and you know, I suffered, you know, on from that. But when I finally did respond to a medication that was inconsistent, whatever, it was because of the relationship. It was a warm, and this isn't about gender, but it happened to be a woman who actually feel her care. I could feel her like human heart feeling my suffering. And for that reason, you know, with whatever else was happening, I responded to a medication that supported me, you know. But you know, all this to say, I had many descents, many emergences, many descents, many emergences. And each time I didn't know when it would happen or how long it would be or how I'd get through. And I also just knew like there's something in the darkness. There was something that deserved commitment. There's something to, I just wasn't willing to give up on, you know. And yeah, so naturally, as many of us are led to, like this led me to want to be of service to others. As I would continue to go through the process again and again, I nothing else really made sense to me other than wanting to continue to understand what was happening um, and offer as best I could what I was learning to hold that space with others. And so I went into grad school, and that's when I met this really beautiful man, you know, and I had some sweet relationships with men before that, but I really didn't know what love was from romantic love. You know, I knew love from my mother. I knew a certain kind of love from my father. I knew a sisterly love, but not a romantic love from a man. And so I was 25 and going into grad school, and yeah, there's this man named Mike, and he was quite a character, quite a hilarious character. A lot of people didn't know what to make of him. He was quite a jokester, trickster, and yeah, we fell in love, and I was really holding in my heart at that time, like not even knowing really what love was, you know, and really asking life to show me what does it mean to be in love, you know. And I kind of let him know with enough hints early on, like, you know, I have this thing that happens and I don't know when it happens or why exactly. And it can also really happen with sexuality. That was a really big trigger for me, where, like many folks, especially women, we can disassociate, right? And we can see ourselves, you know, kind of from below and engaging, but we're not in our body. I know you both are passionate about, you know, embodiment and sexuality and the power of that. And yeah, so that, you know, happened early on in our sexuality, and I had to retreat, but he knew enough and he was intuitive enough to tune into me and check it out. And I could feel his sincerity and also his spaciousness, you know, that whatever our relationship was going to be, sex or not, like he wanted to be connected with me. And that just was amazing to receive the sincerity of that. And so we were together, you know, for ever since that moment, for about 3 years and a season. You'll hear me talk in often non calendar wise ways, but 3 years is calendar wise. So yeah, we were together quite some time and just falling more and more in love. And I really worked hard to reveal myself and stay open to when I was in the descent, when I was in the darkness, like really letting myself be seen and held by him. And I went through a lot, you know, all the stories that I think we hold around being a burden, being, you know, too much, being, you know, undesirable, like all of the things, you know. But I was learning how to hold myself and really learning how to hold the dignity of my process, even if someone else couldn't, you know. And it was a both and, like every time he could show up and hold me a little bit more, those parts within myself that didn't think I deserved that or were worthy of that would breathe a little bit deeper and like, whew, okay, let me try that one on. Like, you know, then I could hold it a little more. And, you know, and if I was rejected, I put that in air quotes, you know, it really feels that way. So I don't mean to undermine that, you know. From the outside, you know, I could have a little bit more curiosity and holding of myself and be like with that psychiatrist story of like, yeah, no, you know, maybe a fuck you or whatever needed to be shared. I'm not usually that fiery, but you know, it's appropriate at times.
With love.
Oh, my dad's been a really good teacher. My dad's been an incredible teacher to extinguish my fire, not extinguish, just dampen it and then bring it back. So thank you, Dad. Yeah, so we were, you know, just doing the dance, and I imagined we would be, you know, together for the rest of this lifetime. And you know, just I really questioned, of course, you know, what I didn't mention, which I just want to be real vulnerable and say too, is after that first time of, you know, initial sexual experiences with him, we weren't able to have intercourse thereafter for the rest of our relationship. And he's an incredibly sexual man, like, you know, real healthy sexuality, thought sex was as natural as breathing, and was really helping kind of the de-shaming process for me around my conditioning with sexuality around that. But I couldn't be penetrated. You know, even that word at that time was just so violent to my system. And you know, he probably I love this quote. It's like every saint has been a sinner. You heard that one?
No, I haven't.
So I got the sense that he also could know those energetics, that where there was a taking from someone that wasn't actually right, you know, to whatever various levels, I don't fully know. But he was at a point in his life where it was really more meaningful for him to give the space and the reward of holding that space for the healing of my sexuality than receiving any kind of momentary sexual satisfaction, which took me a long time to understand and trust, you know. But I started to really get it. I started to really believe it. And so we were in a really big cook, you know, what I would call like an alchemical cauldron of relationship, you know, where the vulnerability was there, the unconditionality of love, and patience, so much patience. And yeah, he was an incredible musician, and we lived together, and was in music recording school. And yeah, one morning we would travel over this big highway, Highway 17, and often we would do it together. But this one morning we traveled separately, and he rode a motorcycle. And this one morning he was struck. And And he was struck by a woman who was likely intoxicated, likely has a huge trauma history, likely has been a sex worker, maybe not by choice or by desperation. And so the next time, I saw him was in the ICU. And, just miraculously, somehow he survived. He was in the ICU, intensive care unit. Um, and, initially it was thought that he might make it. The doctor was kind of saying, like, he's not out of the woods, but like he's showing progress. And he was in a coma, like a self-induced coma, because he lost a lot of blood. And his face was swollen and just a beautiful man. But, he's a vulnerable, fragile human, like we all are, and was, so, I was on a healing table over in the Bay when the crash happened, really inviting healing from my own trauma, and was studying trauma in my thesis of my grad school. And here we are. And so just was really holding the prayers of him coming through, and was really asking, everyone that came, his beloved mother, his former partner, who's the mother of his child, and, my parents and sisters, were just holding the space. And, the doctor, invited the mom and I to um, go into a cottage at the hospital and come back. This was going to be a kind of a marathon journey. And 3 a.m. that morning, we get a call that he's gone. That his brain stopped responding. As many people know about the grief process, just utter shock. It's just really hard to fathom death. Very surreal. Very surreal. I had to ask the doctor a lot of times, like, what do you mean? What do you mean, brain dead? What does that mean? I was just really holding hope for a miracle, and just really asked for everyone around to just feel him as alive, not treat him any differently. And he was an organ donor, so we had 3 days with him, as they keep his body alive to start to prepare for the harvesting of the organs. And and I should just mention, like, before he was declared brain dead, he had his leg amputated, and he was an incredible athlete, incredible mountain biker. And so it's like one of those thresholds where life is never going to be the same, even if he survives. And we go through all of that. We cross the threshold into the initiatory realms, and we're like, okay, there's no going back from that, right? And there's another crossover, So, and so he passed. He passed, and I felt so much grace holding me as well. There was shock, but there was also tremendous presence, and I could feel there's archetypal. I've mentioned I really am passionate about divine feminine archetypes and ritual connected with the archetypal world, and I believe connecting with those that don't know archetypes. Archetypes are these really vital forces of the natural world, vital forces of life that are been known from the beginning of time, and they repeat. They're known through every culture, time, and space, and they inhabit different forms, different names, different embodiments, deities, but also they're in the natural world, and they also want to come through us. And they often do come through us, but often unconsciously. So, which can, have quite a havoc. You invoked Kali Ma earlier, right? And so Kali Ma has, this Hindu deity, incredible Hindu creator, destroyer, preserver goddess. Like, she has a shadow and she has a tremendous light to her, right? Like when she's coming through, part of her myth is like she's in a fucking rage, right? And there's a purity of that divine justice. And when she gets blood hungry, her shadow will come out and she'll keep slicing heads off, right? And her destroyer will, like, cut some life, so the more that we get to know these energies, which are us and not us, we can start to build the capacity to utilize them and harness them and ground and have the vesselship to allow them to support life. And so I just say that as a background, as I knew that this spiral part of my journey and what I was being called into in an initiatory way was into my priestesshood. And what I mean by that,
Had you at the time had an awareness of the spiral path and archetypes?
I was always drawn. Thank you so much for bringing that question. You're right, actually. There was a beautiful woman, a psychotherapist, Leslie, when in my early 20s, that started to bring in archetypal psychology to me. And so when I heard of the probably the first goddess that's ever known is the goddess of descent. And she's known by many different names, but the first known one is Inanna from Sumeria. And then she's been, as these archetypes are just natural forces of nature and life, they're going to be recycled in different times and places with different shifts on myth and story and names.
Or incarnations.
And they're moving with the times, and they're going to show the different shadows of the times and the places. And so the one that I got introduced to was Persephone, and she's a Greek goddess. And so when I heard her story, that's when my soul was like, oh, this is what we're doing. Should I just presence her story briefly?
I just got chills when you were saying that.
Yeah, so Persephone is just such a powerful being. And, and again, she's related to Inanna and many other names like her. But she's really this queen of heaven and also a queen of death. And she's a maiden. She's a very innocent, naive, beautiful maiden, that innocent one in all of us. And her brief story of her myth is, her mother is Demeter. She's the earth goddess mother, the all abundant one that is tending the harvests and allowing fertility and nutrition and nourishment of all of life. And Persephone is, being admired by the underworld god, Hades. And he gets a bad rap because the underworld usually does in most cultures, and especially as we become more patriarchal, which Greek mythology was becoming. Anything dark and sexual and primal and starts to become demonic and scary and all of that. And so Hades is really like, wow, who is this Persephone? And he makes a deal, and I'm blanking on who he makes a deal with, but it might have been Zeus, the sky god, that they basically set up like this arranged, non-consensual, I don't know if you want to call it marriage or enslavement. There's lots of different ways to say it. And
the gods were pretty brutal.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the earth cracks open one day when she's in, springtime glory with the meadows and the flowers, and in her, imagination and her innocence with life, and she's pulled into the underworld, stripped, right? And so this is that mythology, which I was kind of speaking of earlier, like all that I thought I was, all the things that I knew, being in the light, being, known in a certain way, who I was to what I could do, what my role was, what my expectations were, just totally stripped, where it's like my volition to be perceived and do a certain thing was just not there. I just And I think it's a grace. It's fucking terrifying every time it happens, but I also know that's often what we need for our ego to loosen grip. Is like there is kind of that choiceless choice of there's something bigger that can hold you than our ego survival mechanisms. And that's fucking terrifying. And so, yeah, so that she gets stripped, and again, in the Anana perspective, there's a slightly different version where it's more choiceful, and she's removing. It's often correlated with a different chakra system, so she's removing the different gates as she goes down into the underworld to meet her sister who's grieving. That's the Anana story. But with Persephone, she's becomes, with Haiti, um, and she's obviously incredibly frightened, incredibly disoriented, incredibly disillusioned with everything. And meanwhile, her mother Demeter has no idea where she went and is in utter panic and grief. And meanwhile, not so kind Zeus or whoever he was, like, is not letting her in on what actually happened, and so she's going everywhere searching, and in her distraught and her, her grief, like everywhere. And she neglects the crops, because what's the point of anything anymore, right? We know this, like when we're in despair and depression and grief, like I don't give a fuck about life, right? Like, and so, and there's different layers and beautiful, aspects of what this turns into. But the shortened version is, Persephone starts to fall in love with the darkness. She starts to actually see the beauty and the kindness, as fucked up as we might say these different pieces were around, was there consent? Was she raped? Was all these things? But there was some larger story that she needed to be brought down there. She needed to be stripped. She needed to be immersed back into her wholeness with her darkness. And Hades was that messenger. Hades was that beloved. And he, she fell in love with him. She could see through, the conditioning of that she wasn't supposed to love him, and and could see his heart in the darkness, and thus, her expanded nature and who she really was. And so this is where you see the pomegranate often correlated to a lot of the feminine mysteries, and part of the fall time into Samhain and October and Halloween, and the thinning of the veils is the pomegranate is often present, because there was a deal she made with him that he gave her. And there's lots of different versions, but one version is the pact, the vow to each other of her return was through eating, I don't know how many pomegranate seeds, it differs on the story, but maybe 6 pomegranate seeds. And that was her sacrament to say, I choose to return. I'm probably going to forget each time. I might have resistance each time, but I choose to return because this is love. This is wholeness. This is union.
I love that reframe, because I've heard it as she was tricked into eating those so that she could have her for half the year.
And maybe she was. I think there's lots of all the versions I imagine are all true, right?
But I love that reframe. It's like
there's
choice to
right
to be it's like accepting our divine and our human nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as you say that, it makes me feel like that's part of the spiral path too, right? Is like seeing, even when we weren't at choice around really horrific things that we may experience and survive in our life, if we start to do the healing work, we can see, hopefully we can grieve fucking fully and do everything we need to do to honor when we didn't have the choice that we wanted to have. And that there's a larger story that starts to get woven, the gifts of going through that, what gets stripped and then what gets, refined in those fires of hell get to be reclaimed, and we get to reweave a larger, bigger story that can include all the different facets. And that's,
like the story of our souls.
Absolutely. And the spiral journey is like, right, a spiral, we return what seems like a similar thing again and again and again, but we're in a different place, you know, and each time we get to revisit that soul material, that sacred soul material of our traumas, of our losses, of our, you know, of our glory, all of it, you know, and harvest more. And so she takes these seeds and she returns to the upper world. And, you know, a lot went down in the meantime with Demeter and her grief process. But when she returns, of course, utter reunion and just the preciousness of the mother-daughter relationship. Um, and you know, the crops begin. But in that time period, this is also a seasonal myth, that this is why fall and winter befell upon the earth, is that the earth goddess named Demeter in this story, you know, was in a death process, you know, was in a descent process. And so there's that, also that yin, that dark side to our seasonal time that needs to be honored, the natural falling away, the natural release and shedding, so we can be in the fullness of life. And so they have a reunion, and you know, she becomes a queen of heaven, because now, like you said, she's going the full embodiment of seeing the divine nature that she is, you know, and also the very human and messy and dark kind of nature of her. And in that, she becomes a vessel of transmutation. She becomes a vessel of wholeness.
And would you say that your descent around Mike was allowed you to expand deeper, like, or more expand into the light of who you are, like both receiving like the dualities of that?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to take a drink of tea. We're having a tea talk, right?
Yes.
Hydrate.
I like your butterfly mug. So beautiful.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, what was your journey like after this event happened?
I mean, it was so many layers, and I know we only have a limited time, and I could just expand for
Yeah.
and I love it. So just tell me if I need to start wrapping up at a certain time. But you know, there's a lot of layers to it, you know, and the particular part of this story, you know, it was very mythic, and I believe all of our lives are very mythic if we start to open up our eyes to see in that way. And again, it's not to bypass. It's not like a mythic bypass of the horror. It's actually to just hold the horror with a root system and spaciousness that can include everything that we experience. Right? Because when we hear about myths, I just talked about this myth, like that included rape, that included like utter grief, that included like famine, that included like fucking intense things, right? But I think it's really important we start to see the resonance with these ancient myths, and also start to see what myth is ours to live, and what myth is being lived through us, and how do we begin to be co-creators with our soul for the myth that wants to unfold, you know. And so, you know, fortunately was steeping in that, and was steeping in a place of a lot of surrender from all those times that I mentioned, of going into the underworld and feeling zero control over when it would happen, or how, or whether it'd come back, or all of that. And so this was another one of those. And the glory was that the love with Mike was so, he was gone physically, but he was more present in certain ways than ever, you know. And there's beautiful little stories here and there. You know, he would say, he's a beautiful musician, as I mentioned. He loved Willie Nelson, for example. And like, there's a song by Willie Nelson that says, like, you know, put me in your pocket and just take me wherever you go, you know. And he would kind of say that to me when I was having a hard time, and we would separate for the day. And so I just felt his presence now really encompass me all the time, you know. And coming into and meeting him, because of the trauma I had gone through and the disassociation, the idea of like connecting to the spirit world and like non-grounded spirituality was really terrifying to me. Like, I just wanted to like be feet on the ground, like just here, right? And so him leaving was also this really powerful bridge, of safety into a world that I could not follow. Like our hearts, were forever in union, and there was no way that I was not going to follow him there. And I also knew he needed me. He needed me to help him transition. And he needed all those who loved him to love him up, right? And this is where a lot of ancient wisdom traditions knew the practices of holding vigil, holding presence for the departed, being with, with the body as much as we can. So, but there's a lot of mythic pieces, one I'll just share now that just helped me like be an utter, like, what, and also just like, wow, surrender and trust in this crazy world, this crazy myth that's unfolded. He was a rock and roller, kind of with acoustic Spanish guitar, the big hole in his guitar, and like, from a little guy with just like had this passionate energy, and he'd write his own songs often, but he'd cover some really powerful songs, and he'd open his sets with the Dolly Parton song, Jolene. That song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jolene, 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 Jolene. Please don't take him just because you can. Right, that song. And so he would sing that in his opening sets, and he was just on the precipice of, wanting to record his album and opening up, his larger music under his name, Mike Shop, and his next show was really like a day after he died. His first show under his band name, and when the story started to unfold around who hit him, and it was a hit and run. Her car was so damaged that she couldn't drive it. She proceeded to lie and get picked up and say she just hit some inanimate object, and was just hiding from the police for several months as they had to collect all the evidence to arrest her. And crazy, just wild things happen in the meanwhile, where, that's horrific to imagine, right? Like my beloved on the highway with someone that just left, and also tremendous like curiosity of like, why would someone fucking leave, right? I really believe in the goodness of the human heart, and when that is not present, that to me means there's a large disconnection from one's own being, and usually that's from tremendous trauma and a lot of hurt. And so I found out not soon after that the woman that killed him was named Jolene. Was named Jolene. And this was what he was singing. He was singing to this spirit of Jolene. Please don't take me just because you can. Jolene, Jolene, right? And so when I would get these details, as I would just start to see the larger mythic picture of what was unfolding, I just had to like put up my hands and just be like, I surrender to this. And I receive what this is about, This is so much bigger than me and than him. This is something, and even if it was just about me and him, which obviously it wasn't, this impacted so many people who loved him. His son, his mother, his beloved brothers and friends, and, community. I just had to surrender. And that's when that nature of the priestess archetype really came online. The one that knew that I had to hold ritual at his bedside, the one that knew ritual was essential in this process going forward. Like nothing else made sense but to open the sacred space and honor and grieve and see what was there to be known. And beautiful things happened, some hilarious things, some dangerous things happened. I'll just name a few, like, because I presenced it in those last days. I brought a sage stick into the ICU, which is a highly oxygenated room, which is very flammable, not kosher, not a good idea to bring sage into a highly oxygenated ICU room, but we survived. Everybody survived.
Oh,
I got chastised, but everybody survived. And just I want to share one piece because this just kind of gives the mythic piece around the union that happened. I had a hard time becoming physically in union with him while we were alive, sexually, as I mentioned. And when he died, something happened where I felt the union happen. And a nurse asked me if, I wanted to disrobe one more time and be with him, skin to skin. And I did. And, I was playing our favorite music, and I laid down with him and was, in this little hospital bed and holding him, embracing him. And, a couple minutes later, like the nurse comes in pretty startled, and she because my heart was picked up on his heart monitor. And it just felt like a really poetic, beautiful thing, that I'm choosing to live, and there's this, I'm choosing to take the love that was given to me through his heart and carry it forward, and so it was quite a journey. Like so many different stories in between all of that. And coming back to the theme of grief and love, is it just really initiated me into the medicine of grief, the necessity of grief, and the union that it is with our love, and that goes for everything, like I think we still have a very limited understanding of what grief is and what love is. And it's also, I feel it being stripped away. I've never heard grief used as often as it has in these COVID times, in these metamorphosizing times. And so I'm encouraged that we're starting to see the shared threads, the shared tapestry of how we're so connected in our grief, and the expansion that it's not just when people die, but it's also so many forms of loss. And so that was my journey into saying yes to the grief, and the grief was potent. It was like my devotion to him in his life and my love. And fortunately, like I didn't really give a fuck, like a lot of people have some self-consciousness around really grieving, and I just, if there's anyone, if I could be like a small little voice in the tapestry of permission is a thing, like please grieve, and like please know that it's sacred, please know that it's an offering to life and to your heart and to the soul and to the earth and to our survival and our transmutation of pain. And so I just grieved, and I was pretty wild in my grief. I didn't care, like if I was crying in front of some people or if I made people uncomfortable, like, it was hurt. It was hard. It was hard at times where people, grief touches all the griefs. One little thread in the grief is going to touch all the griefs. That little bear that you lost when you were 3, your dog, your favorite dog, the dream that never came to be, like all of the griefs start to unravel. And so it's really edgy. It's provocative when somebody is radically grieving. And that's the medicine of the griever. And so as I learn about kind of the larger mythic, archetypal, ancient history of grief in every culture, there's usually been those beings. They've often been known as like the medicine people or shamanic in some sort of nature, where they were known as those that were closest to the heart, closest to the emotional field, and the medicine of grief were called in. They were like, we're frozen here. There's been such a tragedy here. We're in so much trauma and shutdown. Can you bring in, they were usually women, bring in the grievers so we can start to soften our hearts. We can start to release what cannot be reckoned or transformed any other way. There's no praying our way out of this. There's no like just leaving the land for another place, which I think largely happened for a lot of our European ancestry, right? There's such a quick tragedy and horror that was happening. The grief of that land really hasn't been tended to. And so we just brought all that horror and trauma to every other land that we went to, caused a whole other grief storm that get suppressed. Like I
Mhm.
feels real to me. And the grief, it's an alchemizer. It softens, and it feels like that beautiful Japanese style of pottery. I'm forgetting it right now what the name is. I'll get back to you. But it's where, the brokenness happens, and like they fill it with gold. They fill all
Right.
the cracks with gold. And it feels like those are the waters. Those are the alchemical waters that our grief does,
Mm.
to fill the cracks. And there's no making sense of it, right? There's not like trying to reframe to a more beautiful way. Like you start wherever the fuck you are, and you get the support and the holding and the sacredness to be where you are. And that's the medicine, and over time, those tears turn into golden elixir, and they're life-giving, and because this is also really related to embodiment and sexuality, I want to presence, like, I knew that grief was actually also healing the fluidity of my sexuality.
Mm.
So those were like literally like feeding like the flower of my own, like coming back to life, and like cleansing my womb for, I don't even know what it was entirely holding. I didn't even have to know anymore. Like Mike was the trailhead for sure, and it was like touching into layers I didn't even have a context for, and I kind of believe I was probably working my whole life that I didn't really have a context for. My life story didn't quite match the level of trauma reaction that my body was going through that I referred to earlier. So yeah, so I continue to grieve, and I continue to grieve today. I continue to grieve with you, and I feel so grateful. And I knew that, part of the grief story is also having communal spaces of grief,
Mhm.
because we're just not meant, we can't hold the bigness. We need a bigger container so we can break open into being bigger containers, and cycle through. So we need a larger nervous system. One way to say it, for us to be held and be received, and then to be able to hold and receive, and so on. And so the importance of community grief ritual cannot be understated. And that can look like so many different things, but that's one piece that's become really passionate for me.
Yeah, I've been to a grief ritual held by Dana, and it was absolutely transformative. And honestly, I was going through my own process grieving, but I think witnessing other people was really like deeply healing for me, to feel like I'm not alone in my process. And yeah, it was so amazing. Thank you for that, Dana.
Was that the beach one?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so
Yeah.
glad you were there. Yeah, and
Mhm.
the ocean is such a natural place. So for those that want to enact a sort of grief ritual on their own, I think there's a lot of different grief tenders and ritualists that are being inspired and being called by life to come forth. And I'm one of them here in Santa Cruz with the beloved sisters, and I hope more brothers and other beings start to come into the mix. Um, other heritage, just so we can really get the full holding and weave that we need. But as just a suggestion, the ocean is a natural mother to hold the sorrow. And so right now in the lineage of Priestess lineage that I study under the 13 Moon Mystery School, which is the lineage of Ariel Spilsbury and my teacher Elaine, Doubtry, incredible priestesses. We're in the first moon of the year of the Great Mother, and she's always the beginning of the lunar year. And she's the one that holds us and allows us to surrender to something that can hold us so we can deeply receive. And so the Mama Ocean is often referred to as the Mama Ocean that birthed all of life, birthed life here on this planet, and also holds the sorrows of the world, and can hold it all. She can take life and she can give life, and so if you're feeling like, how do I begin this? How do I start in a way that could, go to the ocean if you can, or go to water if you're not near the ocean, and ask a few friends to hold space, to just hold witness with nothing to fix, nothing to change, nothing is wrong, right? Using the power of the earth to ground, just inviting, supportive energy, allyship in whatever way is real and true for you, to hold the space. And you can set an allocated time to just hold a container, like let's do this for, you know 30 minutes. Let's just see what comes through. I recommend longer, but you can start there as a beginning, and you'll find out. I imagine both of you, like, grief doesn't have really a timeline either, right? It'll come as it will, and it'll end when it will. And we need to allow for that. And it becomes a skill as well of how to grieve, right? Like, and there's a way that those parts of our soul start to come forward when they know they're welcomed, right? They're kind of like, they can be nervous at first. They're like, really? I can come out, right? After all those imprints as a baby of saying, don't cry, or shush, or you're too much, or you make mama and dada uncomfortable, or, right? All of that conditioning to like, oh, I can come out, like, I'm going to be okay. Like, it takes some time to really like get that. And it's, the blessing is that we're kind of in that choice point now, right? Where it's just coming. So if we create space for it, it creates more safety, really, to allow it to be an offering to life.
Thank you, Dana, so much for all of your wisdom. And I always love hearing the story again, because I feel like I pick up on new pieces that I didn't hear before. So thank you.
Yeah, I watched your story on YouTube on the Vagina Monologues.
Universe.
Yeah, sorry, the Universe.
Inspired by the Vagina Monologue. So it's inspired. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, similar but different. But it's beautiful to hear it straight from you, and I really resonate with what you said about when you unlock some grief, how it activates grief from this lifetime and even beyond. I mean, you said your trauma wasn't quite matching what you had experienced, so potentially it was, from previous lifetimes. But I think a lot of people, and myself included, like have this just deep, infinite well of grief, and it feels so scary because of our conditioning, so overwhelming. You said the conditioning of you're making other people feel uncomfortable, you're too much, like, you know, just the conditioning to kind of stuff our emotions down to appease the family or whoever we're around.
Yeah.
But like the circle path, like our grief, it's in cycles. And
Absolutely.
so just to let people know that it's safe to feel your grief, and it's a vital piece of our individual and collective evolution on this planet. And I also love what you said about after that grieving process, how it was cleansing the blockages around your sexual energy, because for so many women, our frozen emotions, anger, grief, all of the things that we have suppressed over years and years and years, that is blocking our sexual vitality, our life force, our orgasmic potential. So yes, the invitation is to really begin to get curious about and embrace one's grief, and to
And I just
learn.
want to thank you for sharing that, Samantha. Just so real, right? Like, I think it's really important we honor like our inner protectors that have kept us from not going there, right? There's actually intelligence from those parts, because there hasn't been often the holding or the framework or the sacredness that our soul and our system needs, our body needs to actually go there. So I think it's really important to say, like, yeah, that's really real. Like, that you haven't gone there at certain times, like, was probably pretty darn appropriate. And now there's something else that's being asked, and there's more resource here. There's more, opening to a safety that's beyond what we think is safety. There's like, life really isn't that safe, like,
The natural world.
no, we're gonna die, and like, how do we involve layers of safety that allows us to open to that truth?
It's an ongoing exploration. I just want to say I bow to you, Priestess Dana, because I see you, and I recognize and acknowledge what a powerful force and presence you are in this Santa Cruz community, and how needed your work is. And I hope that you hold a grief ceremony soon, because I would absolutely love to come.
We will be in the spring for sure. I will let y'all know. Yeah, I'm so honored to be here. Were you gonna say something, Janessa?
Yeah, where can people find you and connect with you?
Yeah, good question. I'm still one of those that have not created a website for myself.
Okay, I don't have a website either.
But one day there'll be one. Sacred Grief Healing is the the organization that we've created here in Santa Cruz, and Hannah Idalia and Becca Fresco have been the ritualists with me, and so that's coming. But in the meanwhile, you're welcome to. I can give you my email or something, and
Perfect.
reach me
I'll
that
put all
way.
the links.
And
Great.
yeah, and I could share so much more. I could just feel this fountain
Yeah.
of wanting to connect so many different things, and
There are so many branches that we could
so
have gone
many
off
branches.
into.
And,
Yeah.
and I also just want to name like one last thing, that the opening to the grief and the love. I think a lot of people wonder, like, well, what happens after? Like, and one of my encouragements is like when we open up this fountain and like the surrender to fully loving and fully grieving and work on that skill and that surrender to do so, the fear around losing, it's not that it's not there, but there's a fluidity, there's like a fullness, there's a joy even to know that if I'm gonna love this big, I'm gonna grieve this big, and when I grieve this big, I receive that much more love. It's like to shut that down becomes not connected with life. So I've loved a man hugely since and had to let go hugely since. And it was because of my path with Mike that allowed me to go fully in it with full abandon, and also let go fully and start again, So I want to share that, like, that the grief has so much freedom in it to say yes to life. I'll just present one last quote. Saban Fusame, who's incredible African priestess, ritualist, who's passed on, who brought these rituals to the United States. She says to say yes to life, or to say yes to grief, is to say yes to life.
Oh, love that. Thank you again, Dana, so much for being here and for sharing. Appreciating you so much.
I vow to both of you, you beautiful, beautiful beings and women and sisters. And I'm so grateful to know you in the flesh and witness your sisterhood and path and service flourish and come forth. And I look forward to the next time.
Likewise. Thank you so
Yay.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening.